If you really want to make the world a better place, please pay attention. Think about the air you breathe. You currently do not have to pay any other human for that air, right? It's a pre-existing natural resource, right? It's part of nature, it's part of creation. And importantly, it's needed for survival. If someone were to today appear on the television screen and say, I'm the new ruler of the world, and my first decree is that every breath you take is going to be taxed, and you're going to have to pay me, $5 for every breath you take. People would think that this is insane, right? It's like it would be considered the most crazy totalitarianism ever conceived of, right? So most people, I think, get that that would be unjust. But for reasons I do not understand, they don't make the connection with the other natural resources needed for survival and freedom, namely land and water, right? Let's start with water. It's easy to understand as air is, right? You all know you need water to survive, right? If you don't drink water for a few days, your body dies, right? Common knowledge, no argument there, right? It's a natural resource, pre-existing in nature, needed for survival, just like air, right? So just like it doesn't make sense for someone to charge other humans for access to that natural resource needed for survival, just as it does not make sense to have to pay other humans just to breathe the air, does it make sense somehow suddenly that you have to pay other humans for access to water, which is also a natural resource needed for survival, right? That if you're denied access to, will kill you, right? If you don't have air, you die. If you don't have water, you die. No humans created the air, no humans created the water, pre-existing in nature, right? Whether you believe in a creator or not, you'd have to agree that humans did not create the air and the water, right? And that you need them to survive, right? So, is it really that wild of an idea to point out that it would be unjust to restrict access to these natural resources and to force people or coerce people to pay you to have access to these resources needed for survival? Or is that just common sense ethics? Or is that just, recognizing basic fairness? As I explained in the scenario of landing on an uninhabited island, you're on a boat trip, you get stranded on an uninhabited island. What's the common sense, ethical way to handle that? You all share the land, the fresh water, and any food on the island. Why? Because you all need it for survival, and it's pre-existing in nature, and it would be unfair for anyone to monopolize those resources and charge the other humans for access to them. This is just common sense ethics, right? That's why I started the last talk with saying apparently people are under mind control because they can't fathom this. So you might have followed me as far as the water, but then what about the land? People seem to have the most objection to this, as if it's the most absurd of the ideas that I'm presenting. When actually it makes just as much sense as saying air and water are a birthright. It makes just as much sense to say land is a birthright. Not only because we need the land for survival, obviously, right? You need a place to sleep at night, don't you? Isn't that necessary for human survival? Don't we actually need land to produce food, right? To grow vegetables and fruit trees and nut trees and such, right? Isn't that where food comes from? Don't we need the food to survive? Yes, right? So it's another natural resource needed for survival. And this needed for survival is the key point that free market capitalists seem to ignore completely, as if it's irrelevant. They talk about all goods as if they're all just one and the same. But they're not. Just as your own human body is not up for sale, right? Just as slavery is an invalid purchase of another human body, right? Denying people access to the few natural resources they need for survival and freedom is also a form of slavery. It's not complicated. And people are, as Henry David Thoreau said, hacking at the branches of evil and missing the root. People are rightly complaining about, unjust military violence, killing massive numbers of civilians, you know, dropping bombs on towns and other forms of horrific violence that are taxpayer funded, right? People are rightly upset about, various political issues, from medical tyranny to disarming nonviolent people to, bizarre and harmful things being taught to children in schools and state schools, and, worries about the economy and, possibly World War III and all these things that are actually branches, right? Especially if they're tax funded, right? Well, if everyone had their own sovereign homestead that they didn't have to pay taxes on, right? Basically had your own little country of your own, that would end all the funding to all these horrible practices and policies. So it would basically solve all of the political problems. It would basically solve all the economic problems, because the number one expense of paying rent or a mortgage, just the basics of survival, would be greatly diminished, because you'd have your own land and your own water, and you'd be able to grow your own food, right? It would be the greatest help, greatest financial, economic help that you could ever come by, better than any welfare program. That's just a temporary fix, and actually can just keep you in a cycle of dependency. I know to some people, talking about land and water access can seem not that important. Like, you might be thinking this is sort of impractical idealism, and in the real world we need to be focusing on the upcoming presidential election, or, issues with the economy, inflation, etc., right? And I can understand that perspective, but the truth is, if you were to zoom out and look at the big picture, that quote that I included as a comment in the previous talk, that all the world's problems can be solved in a garden, really does hold weight. There is massive truth to that. For example, on the economic level, if you're concerned with things like inflation or poverty, rising costs of basic living expenses, well, you should be able to recognize that if everyone had their own land and water without cost, without any taxes put on them, that would greatly reduce any negative effect caused by negative aspects of the economy, right? Inflation wouldn't matter nearly as much. Market crash wouldn't matter as much, right? Because you would have that solid economic base of having a place to sleep at night without having to worry about paying the rent or paying the mortgage, right? Again, the number one expense for most people is just paying for a place to sleep on the earth at night, right? Like, you can't just be a human being on planet Earth without having to pay other humans just to be left alone and lay down and sleep for 8 hours, right? Like, that is actually a fundamental injustice. It's the root injustice that all the other injustice is basically built upon. And like I said in the first talk, all of the counter arguments don't hold up. And, I invited people to share their objections to see maybe I'm missing something, even though I've been saying this for years and been listening to objections for years, and they're always basically the same handful of objections that don't hold any weight. I said, well, please enlighten me if I'm somehow missing something. And all I got was the same old, same old. I got basically might is right. I got one more example of false morality as a supposed justification for the way things are. Telling me, well, basically, not everyone's going to like that. Not everyone's going to like the idea of land and water being a birthright. Fair share, homesteading scale, land and water being a birthright. Not everybody's going to like that. As if that disproves my premise or my point that it should be considered a birthright. Just because someone doesn't recognize it or doesn't like it doesn't mean it's not a moral fact, right? A moral fact doesn't stop it being a moral fact just because somebody doesn't like the moral fact, right? This might is right, false morality is similar to thinking like feelings matter more than facts, right? It's like, well, that might upset some people. It's irrelevant. I'm not arguing what's going to make everyone feel the best in the world. I'm arguing what is the most just thing. And why does this matter? Why does arguing the point matter if powerful, abusive people are just going to ignore the truth anyway? Well, there's a reason why propaganda is so pervasive, and that's because what we believe does actually matter. If everyone on Earth believed that a fair share of land and water should be a birthright, it would be a birthright, right? Because there'd be no resistance to the idea, right? So every person that realizes this moral fact and believes in it is one step closer to it actually being realized. just by the belief in and of itself, right? Again, because the only thing stopping this from becoming realized is the beliefs of other people, right? And so if you have a majority of people believing that this is correct, well, then it would just naturally unfold that way. And then all the arguments or objections based on like logistics, like, well, how would you carry this out and who would get the best land? All of that is actually irrelevant. That's not a major obstacle. If everyone's agreeing that we should all share the earth with one another without having to pay each other just to live on this planet, you know, the on the ground logistics of actually everyone finding an acre to call their own for the time they're on this planet would not be an issue. And yet it's made as if it's an issue and somehow, again, a refutation of the principle, which it's not. Because, again, even if people did disagree, the disagreement in and of itself doesn't disprove the argument. You can't say your argument is false because some people don't agree with that argument. That's basically the counter arguments I've been getting in large part, and it's just obviously not sound. It's obviously hollow. I gave the illustration of imagine you and a bunch of other people ended up stranded on a uninhabited island somewhere. Wouldn't it make sense to share the space and the fresh water and food found on the island? Let me give you another example. Imagine there's a small village and everyone there is living what you might say is a primitive lifestyle, or just a very simple natural lifestyle. They all have little gardens or maybe a farm they collectively work on. All their homes are hand-built natural materials, simple, natural, rural little village, right? And imagine in this village there's one well, right, that for generations they've been utilizing. And since this is a very small village, everyone in the village uses the same well to get their water because it's a dry region, isn't much rainfall, they really depend on this well. And just imagine everyone in the village is just on a regular basis going to the well, getting a bucket of water, bringing it back to their home, and just it's no problem. Everyone just cooperates. If two people come to the well at the same time, it's not like they're fighting each other over it. They're probably just going to have a nice conversation, while one person's getting his water and then the other person just follows suit, right? Okay, so not that hard to imagine this scenario, which is realistic, right? As far as human history goes. Now imagine someone from a far off land one day just arrives and says, oh, you all actually live in this country. You didn't realize that, but there's this guy far away, thousands of miles away, and he's actually your president, or he's your king, and he actually owns everything in this whole land, including your well. But I just paid him, some money. I gave him a few gold coins, and I'm now the owner of this well and all the water within it. So you all and your children and your children's children will have to work for me for the rest of your lives to just continue to have access to that water that you need for survival. Would you say that is fair? Right? So this is where the libertarian free market capitalist view is lacking, because they just seem to think, well, as long as you purchase something, it's totally fine. like zero restrictions, completely free market. But that's absurd because there are some things that should not be considered for sale, starting with your own body, right? It's the same argument that slave masters used when people objected to them having slaves, or said that they should free their slaves or release their slaves. They said, well, I paid money for this slave. I have my receipt right here. I have the paperwork. I paid my good money. But that wasn't a good argument, right? It wasn't valid because it was actually violating the private property of that person, namely, the most fundamental form of private property, which is their own body, right? So the completely free market capitalism, libertarians will accept, is not valid concerning the purchase of human bodies, but then they fall off the cliff of logic when it comes to land and water. But it's not really that big of a leap in reasoning to see that they're related, that it's the same principle, because these natural resources are necessary for survival. And if you're denied what's needed for your survival and told that the only way that you can have them is to serve someone else or pay someone else, that's a form of slavery, right? And it's denying you your right to life and liberty, right? It's very straightforward, but this libertarian side will just kind of fixate on the absurdities of the left and socialism and, basically be blind to their own failings philosophically. They seem to, hold this perspective that many on the left rightly criticize, where they seem to hold the view that, oh, well, if you just work hard enough, you can have access to everything you need. Right? And this is just obviously false, right? Like, there are people working very hard every day, and they can't afford their own land. So it's not a matter of hard work. And it's oftentimes not even an option to exercise the hard work because there's no jobs available, right? So if you're just assuming that there are these great jobs always available to everyone all the time, which is false, and then you're assuming that the amount that you're being paid by this supposed great job that you always have access to and is not exploitative or, unjust in any way, the amount that you're getting paid enables you to purchase your own land, that's also false, right? Most people are not earning enough to purchase their own land, to have the homestead of their own. And even if they did, they still wouldn't be, even if they had that much money, most still would not be able to live naturally and freely on that land because they have to keep working to pay the property taxes, right? So this idea that you can live naturally and freely if you just, put some elbow grease into it, is denying the injustice of having to pay other people in the first place, and the fact that earning the money is not a given. It's not just a matter of willingness to work. Like I said, there aren't always jobs available, and the jobs that are available may be insufficient. Almost certainly so. Like I said, there's no common, it's not common for people to just be working on the land and living naturally if they so choose. And being an entrepreneur can be a good alternative, but it's not a given either. There's no guarantee that people are going to buy your product or service. A lot of people talk about, well, it's just a matter of, producing something of value to society, like as if that guarantees purchase of your product or service. It definitely does not guarantee purchase. What if everyone else is struggling to survive too? What if everyone else is in poverty? They don't have money to buy your service, right? Or what if they just don't recognize the value of your service? What if they have absurd objections to whatever, say you're writing books on social justice and they're of extreme value, but most people don't recognize the value. Well, I guess you just gotta be poor and, not have your own garden because free market capitalism, right? It just doesn't make sense. It's not actually just. It's a huge blind spot. So the socialists have it wrong because they think the state is the answer. Oh, we need this welfare system, which is completely moronic because it ignores the fact that you're looking to a system based on extortion, right, to be the vehicle for social justice. You're looking for extortionists to be caretakers, right, which is contradiction in terms and also ignores the psychological and historical reality of power corrupting, right? This idea that we can just automate taxation, automate extortion, and everything's just going to work out dandy, right? They're not going to use those tax dollars for anything horrible like they always do. It's all just going to go to good things like the roads. So, yeah, socialism, communism is moronic, but this idea that just the free market alone, without any recognition of natural resource birthright, is the alternative solution is also wrong. So the true social justice would be what you could call an agrarian anarchism, right? The absence of this extortion system, the absence of extortionist rulers, but also the absence of the injustice of being denied your fair share of land and water as a human birthright. That would combine the call for, equity and social equality and social justice that the left calls for, and also recognize the need to end all of the abuse of control from states that, the libertarian or right calls for. So everybody's got it wrong. And again, when I'm pointing out the way in the middle that is actually correct, all I get is objections like, well, not everybody's going to like that. So if you have a different objection other than might makes right, which is a logical fallacy and not a sound argument, feel free to comment below. Or if you actually agree with what I'm saying and makes sense to you, that would be nice to hear. You can let me know that as well. All right, I hope you found this insightful. Thanks for listening.